Hey everybody, it's time to talk about accessing the FedNow service, as in, how are you going to do it? You see, every financial institution participant is going to have one of those participant profiles and then needs to really determine how they're going to be connecting to the FedNow service. Now, connecting to the FedNow service, there's a few ways it can be done. The first one is called Direct Connect. That means that your financial institution has the people, the staff, the users that can access and manage a FedNow 24/7, 365 connection and the processing, and can actually interface directly with the FedNow service from your bank or credit union. And most likely you'll be using the FedNow portal or a systems user face that you've created. That's the first option, where you go directly on your own, or the option of using a service provider. Now, if you're using a service provider to access the FedNow interface, they will provide you access through them. The service provider is the helping hand, and they can provide things like software interfaces on the front end, sometimes even on the back end. And that's to help you manage all the reports, all the activity, the users you have on the system. And also, it helps you to be able to monitor your master account balance for your users on the system, or provide the FedNow service connection management that is required. Service providers can do all or only parts of this based on what you want and what your participation type is. A service provider can be used when you connect direct to, or you can choose to use a service provider for your connection. So it's kind of like the direct connect can be with the service provider on its own, or you can just use a service provider. Up to you. Just know that having access directly on your own or through a service provider is required. Well, why? Because this access is crucial, because it lets you actually modify settings and your components in the FedNow service. And all of this is set up and configured in a participant profile. Now, the connection options, there is again the direct, and that's an option in a profile. Your financial institution connects directly to the FedNow service. There is the service provider. Your financial institution connects to the FedNow service via one or possibly more service providers. And then there is the direct and service provider. And that's where your financial institution connects directly to the FedNow service and via one or more service providers. So you have multiples kind of involved there. Now, another option is to connect via a correspondent. Now, this could be where a correspondent is actually working as a service provider, which is really a financial institution working as a service provider, but is also providing correspondent services as well. It's basically a financial institution like a banker's bank or corporate credit union that serves both roles. They work as a service provider and they work as a correspondent. As a service provider, they give you the ability to connect to the system. As a correspondent, they help you with managing your master account. Oh, and a couple important notes on correspondence and whether or not they have to have a profile created. Usually they do. Now, if a correspondent, again, the entity helping with settlement, like the banker's bank or the corporate credit union, wants to send and or receive messages or get account notifications and get those reports from the FedNow service, that correspondent needs a specific profile created on their own FedNow participant profile. A correspondent can also work, like I said, as a service provider and give you software access or FedNow access on top of managing and monitoring FedNow master accounts. Will require a profile. However, if a correspondent doesn't want to get any messages or reports, or if they don't need the use of the FedNow interface, then they don't need a profile if they're not going to do any of that. No profile is required for correspondents that will not and do not want to be receiving messages or reports or want to be able to access the FedNow interface. So that's kind of a rare situation, I believe. Financial institutions acting as a correspondent or going direct, the correspondent will connect directly to the FedNow service if that's how they want to work. But again, it's more like being a service provider then. It will require a participant profile. It also requires an authorized connection profile for how that connection is taking place. Now, financial institutions acting as a service provider or going direct, well, that service provider connects directly to the FedNow service on behalf of one or more of the participants. That is going to require an authorized connection profile. And next one we have too is going to be a financial institution acting as a correspondent. No connection to the FedNow service, no messages, no reports, no profile needed. But if for any reason you do have reports, messages, or connection, you're going to have one of those profiles. So what about that authorized connection profile and who actually needs it? Remember, an authorized connection profile sets the rules for how you can connect to the FedNow system and send or receive messages. It should really be the authorized connection. Oh, it is the authorized connection profile because it's about your connection. You see, everyone using the system, all of our participants, must either have an authorized connection profile or be linked to someone who does, like a service provider. That's why it's one of our connection types. All financial institutions, correspondents, or service providers that connect directly to the FedNow service on behalf of one or more FedNow participants or just on their own require an authorized connection profile for that to be completed. So lots of different ways, direct, through a service provider, working with correspondents, all of them though, we're going to have that authorized connection profile because they work with what we call a connection party. Oh no, new terminology, which the connection party sets up the primary connection. We're going to go into more detail on connection parties later. For now, it's just important to know what these different options are. So how do these profiles and messages work? First of all, every participant profile, the one needed to be able to say, hey, I send or I receive, links to one of those connection parties. And this is owned and linked to a authorized connection profile. So it's like one links to the other. And all of your messages flow in and out of the FedNow service based on permissions given within a participant profile, which you set up during onboarding. Essentially, when someone wants to send or receive a message through FedNow, these profiles and the permissions within them determine how the messages get there, who can read the messages, what reports are available to who, and what they can do with them within the FedNow service. Now, there are some profile components to be aware of. Profiles have several components that are set based on the preferences of the participant or possibly based on what the service provider wants to have set up. It depends on the situation. See, the participant profile, it's linked to a routing number. Well, the authorized connection profile can be linked to either a routing number or another identifier called an ETI. Quick side note on that one. An ETI is an electronic transaction identifier. The ETI is a 9-digit identification number that is assigned to organizations that are not financial institutions, but process payment transactions on behalf of financial institutions. ETIs are used in the FedNow service to identify these processing organizations, service providers basically, and to ensure that they are authorized to send and receive payment messages. Back to your profile that we were talking about and those components. So as I said, a profile could have a lot of different components. And profiles may be interconnected through a connection party. And if there are multiple profiles using the same connection or using the same service provider, that's where we're going to have that interconnectedness. Basically, for a financial institution to participate in the FedNow service, they need to set up a specific profile. And they need to say whether they connect direct, connect to a service provider, or using a correspondent. These profiles determine how messages are sent and received, what permissions they have, and basically keep track of who is on the FedNow service, who those different organizations are, and what processing they can and are allowed to do. So when it comes to setting up and accessing the FedNow service, your profile, your way of connecting, determines what's going to happen. We got more coming on all of this, so stay tuned. But for now, class dismissed.